welcome my various current PhD students who agreed to it. So I guess so the idea is this. Here's my concept of what we're doing here. In a couple weeks, you guys are gonna have your final project presentations. And then over the next couple weeks, we're gonna look at your drafts of your papers, which I'm gonna ask you to prepare, and we'll exchange them, and then we'll also do practice talks, and then we'll give comments on the talks, and then we'll have final everything. That makes sense? I feel like, let's just iterate on the process is actually better than just having one final thing. You get more feedback. Make sense? All right. But this is like examples of like finished research. So you can kind of see what a finished research talk looks like. So we'll start off with Eric, who's going to talk about something that I think that he's going to go to present in Rio de Janeiro. Yeah, in a few days. Is that right? Yep. Okay. Welcome, Eric.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, let me start my little timer here. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Eric Todd, and I'll be presenting my work on in-context algebra. So I kind of want to just start out with some algebra puzzles, just kind of get you in the mindset of why I think this work is cool. So this is an easy one. I've put an equation here, 2a equals 6, in a purple box where I want you to tell me what the answer is. You just shout it out if you know the answer. 3, great, perfect. Yep, it's not supposed to be a trick question. Okay, if we change the numbers, anybody have a clue as what we put in the purple box here? 6, great, you guys are geniuses. Okay, I want to point out kind of two things you guys are doing kind of implicitly when you're solving these problems. So the first one is, you know to treat a as a variable, which means that a doesn't have any meaning beforehand, but as soon as you see it in a problem, now you have some context as to what a might be. And the second thing is, you have some prior knowledge that you've built up about how numbers work and what they mean, and the numbers tell us something about it. So this kind of leads me to the question I want to talk about today, which is like, if we strip away all the meaning from words, like how do language models understand them anyway? For example, like in the algebra problems that we're looking at just barely, we used what we knew about numbers to understand the variable a. And this is interesting because like in language models, we study meaning normally from words up, where like models learn what individual words mean and then how they interact with others in a context. But in the case of variables, their meaning is entirely dependent on the context in which they appear. And this is kind of what I find so interesting about algebra, is it's the study of contextual interactions. So in my research, I'm interested in how language models do contextual reasoning. And in this talk, we're going to look at like how we can use algebra to study what contextual reasoning looks like when tokens act as variables. So here's another algebra puzzle. It's a little bit different. Instead of using numbers, now everything is a variable. So on the left, you can see a series of facts. And on the right, I've put another purple box. So go ahead and take a look at the facts. Sorry if you can't see here. And take a second to look and see if you can pick one of these 4 letters that you might think might answer the question in the purple box here. A, great, yeah. Yeah, A is right. And maybe what you did is you saw this question, you're like, DA is already in here, I'll just copy this answer over and I'll say A, and you'd be right. But what if I told you you can get another answer if you remove the first fact here? It's another puzzle. You remove the first fact, you can still solve it. Any ideas here, what you might put in the purple box? A? Okay. Pretty confident? Not that confident? You're right. And maybe here's how you get this. Maybe this is what you were thinking. You notice that B times D gives me B. That sort of looks like D is acting like the number 1 or like the identity. And if you apply that same logic here, if you apply DA, you get back A, which would be the right answer. And remember, we didn't really know anything about A, B, C, or D beforehand. We sort of just learned everything purely from how these letters interact with each other in the context. So we call this kind of task in-context algebra. And the main idea is this. Each token is a variable that can represent any algebraic element. And by variable, I just mean that the value of a token is fixed within some sequence, but can vary across sequences. So here is an example of what the data that the model might see. where it's a sequence of facts, and the goal of the model is to predict like the product of two variables. So in this case, we have like EJ equals, and the goal of the model is to predict E. And we trained a bunch of small transformers from scratch on this problem. And the main results I'll be discussing today use a model that looks like this, that has 4 layers with 8 attention heads per layer. And then we use just standard row positional embeddings and a vocabulary size of 18, where 16 of those are variable tokens and 2 are like special structural tokens. And then we just use a standard autoregressive cross entropy loss. So the first thing we look at is whether transformers can solve these kind of weird in-context algebra puzzles, because this is sort of different from how regular language models embeddings work. Like here, the token embedding is basically meaningless. And it turns out that models are actually pretty good at solving these things. Here I'm showing the in-context learning accuracy for cyclic groups, where the y-axis shows the model's performance and the x-axis shows the number of facts that we present in a given context. You can see that performance gets better as we add more context, and that larger groups require more context to solve than smaller ones. We also test on slightly harder kind of groups called dihedral groups, and we see a pretty similar trend. So to get the training data that we use to train our models and test them, it's actually a pretty hard problem that these models are solving. Here, we're showing that we actually are sampling a mixture of groups for every sequence, and they can include both cyclic and dihedral groups. And you can see that it ends up being pretty diverse as we randomize both the groups that are sampled and the vocabulary assignment for each sequence. So before I showed you the holdout performance on the in-distribution groups, but also if you test on groups that the model didn't see during training, it also does pretty well at those. So let's just like recap a little bit about what we've talked about so far here. We saw like in-context algebra is a way that allows us to study how transformers deal with variables. And we've seen that transformers are actually pretty good at solving these kinds of algebraic puzzles. So the remainder of the time, I want to focus on kind of how we can understand what these models have learned using causal interventions, and then look at some of the mechanisms that we found and how we can like peel them apart. So I think for me, one of the hardest things about doing interpretability research is like coming up with a hypothesis about how a transformer might solve a particular problem. So here I'm just showing like the model's accuracy over a random distribution of the training data. And you can see that it solves about 92% of the data. And one goal we might have is like maybe we could come up with a curve, a similar curve of the performance of the model that we can explain from the data. But how exactly could we do something like this? If we think back to the algebra puzzle that we solved together, maybe you could think about, copying was a simple strategy that we saw. And copying is actually maybe the simplest form of contextual reasoning. It's actually pretty well studied in the literature. So you're familiar maybe with the induction heads paper from Anthropic, where they introduce induction heads. But just to kind of briefly recap how an induction head works, if you have repeated tokens in a context, such as I hear the cardinals, an induction head would look back at the repeated text and copy that token forward. And this is actually pretty powerful. About 30% of all the tokens in like standard language model pre-training can be solved just via this simple copying mechanism. And if we measure the percent of sequences in our training data that are solvable via copying, we find that it actually explains about 68% of the training data. So it's like quite a bit more than like standard language modeling data. But this makes sense based on like the structure of our data. There's a lot of repeated sequences here, just repeated facts. So the next thing we might want to do is to verify whether the model is actually like doing copying or not. And we can do that via causal interventions. Sorry. So to check whether like the model actually implements copying behavior, we can trace the model's computation using causal intervention. So we can localize copying behavior maybe to specific attention heads, where here we use like specific pairs of sequences that differ in some key way. In this case, we use a sequence where copying is possible and another one where it's not. So on the left, I'm just going out of the way here. You'll notice like the query here, hj equals is repeated in the context. And if a head was responsible for implementing copying, it might attend to this p token and copy it forward. So to measure which heads are actually doing this, we can run both sequences through the model and then patch activations between the two runs and measure which heads change the new run's probability to the counterfactual answer, which would be P. So we can do this over all the attention heads, and maybe we'll find one that does this sort of copying behavior. And it turns out if you do this over all the heads, there's actually just one head in this model that does this copying. And if we look at the attention patterns of this head over the copying sequences, you can see that it does in fact attend to the answers of the duplicate facts. And if you want to interpret like the contribution of this head to the model's prediction, you can use the logic lens to project its output and then show that this head actually is just strongly copying the token that it attends to. So based on this analysis, we could be pretty confident that our model is doing copying internally. And if we test it on a subset of data where copying is always possible, it gets 100% accuracy. So we know the model can do copying, but there's still kind of this large gap of stuff that we haven't really explained in the training data. So what else is there? What else has the model learned? Well, we think we understand maybe one attention head, and what if we like filter out all the copying data to see what else is this head doing? If we follow that process and filter out the copying data, we actually find that it has another interesting behavior that we call commutative copying, where instead of attending to exact copies, it now attends to commutative pairs. So here we've got KC as the query, and now it attends to CK instead of KC. And if we run the same kind of experiments, activation patching and logic lens on this head, we can see that it is still doing copying, and it turns out that there's only still one head that does this behavior in the model. And then if we test on a small data distribution, we also find the model is able to do this kind of procedure pretty reliably. So now if we add this little percentage of how much can commutative copying explain, we get another little boost here, and we can explain about 80% of the training data. But I would say that maybe the most interesting stuff is still in this gap. Copying has been well studied. So if we think about kind of this holdout data where copying is not possible, we actually see the model can solve about 90% of this data, and it sort of feels like we're back where we started. We haven't really made much progress, but I feel like we have a good recipe maybe at how we can tackle this problem of like identifying sort of this bag of mechanisms that a model has developed. So that's what we'll talk about next, is how can we sort of peel apart. There's all these mechanisms that are happening in parallel. How can we peel them apart? And maybe you noticed this from the first example, is there were two facts that could both solve the sequence. And the strategy that we identified was, well, we can identify kind of these data subsequences where only one strategy is possible, and that helps us to isolate some behavior that's interesting. So we take this new set of data on holdout where we can't do copying, and we propose 3 additional strategies that might solve this unexplained gap. These are like the identity, a cancellation strategy, and an associative strategy. And just these 3 strategies are able to explain most of the holdout performance of the model. And when we create like specific data distributions and test the model on them, we find that it does pretty well on the identity and the cancellation data, but actually struggles a bit with the associativity data constraint. So next I'll just try and cover like how does the model implement the 2 that we're pretty confident that it does learn, which is the identity and cancellation. So for the identity, we can do a similar causal experiment where we construct sequence pairs that help us identify activations that are related to the identity processing. So if we expect kind of an activation to represent the identity, we'd expect when we patch stuff that the receiving sequence will flip its prediction to act as if one of the query symbols is now an identity. So we can do a similar patching experiment, and it turns out that we find 2 heads that have strong causal effects. And we sort of are able to break down this process into 2 components. So there's one head that's doing what we call query promotion, where a head promotes both of the symbols in the query. And the second head does something that we call identity demotion, where a separate head attends to identity facts in the context and then demotes the identity token. I guess, yeah, which when you combine those two operations, you get the non-identity total promoted, which is exactly what you'd want. Okay, the last mechanism that I'll talk about is called closure-based cancellation. So this is based on like the cancellation law, which tells us that if you have two products that are equal and they share an element on the left or the right, then their elements are also, the other element is also equal. And kind of the high level intuition behind this mechanism is that the model computes a difference of two sets. We call the closure set and the cancellation set. And maybe like Sudoku is a good way to think about this. So Sudoku, like the closure set is just like the possible answers for a square. So in this case, it's like 1 through 9. And then you can think about the cancellation set as like things that you can do to eliminate answers. So in this case, you can think about like the row and the column and the square give you numbers to eliminate. And also like there's also extra constraints in Sudoku. For example, like here, you know that the two rows above and this column here tell you that this square has to be 8, for example. So we see evidence of the model performing these kinds of operations as well. And it's actually spread across several attention heads. So what we do is we learn a subspace via similar causal intervention experiments. And then what we do is we trace these mechanisms as they evolve throughout training, and we find a nice trend of simpler mechanisms being learned first, and then evolving to more complex mechanisms over time. So just as in conclusion, we see that kind of language models can reason about words that have no definition. Causal interventions can allow us to see models' internal algorithms, and you can sort of peel apart these parallel mechanisms with like targeted data. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions. Todd, any questions?
Yeah, I guess like how does this, do you think there is any relation between the model understanding variables versus a model understanding, even though it's not like it doesn't do mask generations, but in case like understanding what the mask generation is there do you think any connection between these?
Sorry, so you're asking like if the model were to do mask generation,
yeah,
if it would treat it differently?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point. Like, I guess you could treat the mask token in like BERT, for example, as like a variable that is given meaning based on its context. So that's a similar problem. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, Race, did you have a question?
I'm just wondering, have you tried like training only on data that does not have copy, that's like it's not possible to copy?
I haven't. I feel like it would be pretty tricky because I guess if it's not autoregressive, you can do it. But like when you do autoregressive loss, there's like intermittent losses in there where there might be copying possible. So even if like the last effect might not appear anywhere in the sequence, like maybe there's repeated intermediate facts. But you could construct it so that there's like zero repetition at all, and then see what happens. And like Sheridan and some other students in our lab did something like this for like language modeling. And yeah, there's a paper called like in context learning without copying. You can check it out.
Thank you, Eric. Okay. Yeah, you can ask him more about this type of stuff if you're interested. I'm gonna turn the mic over to Sheridan, who has another paper. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, so I'm Sheridan. I'm one of David's students, and today I'm going to talk about a project that I just did for the past few months at a fellowship. So this was like done with like a bunch of collaborators at the startup Goodfire. This is my like fellow project. So also the other research fellow, Todd, was like a huge, we were like partners on this project. And then also Atticus was the mentor for this project. So the big question that we were asking with this project is like kind of grand, and it's like, does structure and representations imply structure and computation? But specifically, like what we were actually like looking at in this project was just one little specific example of that, which is like circular representations of concepts. So there's this previous paper that found that models, language models have like circular representations of like months and days of the week. And so what we were asking in this project is like, if models have these representations, how do they actually like use that like geometry or use that structure to like compute things? So for example, if you ask like, what month is 4 months after October, or what day is 2 days after Friday? We also looked at like 24-hour time as well. And these are all concepts that have like the circular geometry in representations, but we wanted to figure out how exactly that was like used for models being able to actually answer these questions. So the model that we looked at, we just studied one model, Llama 3.8b, and here's what like our prompts actually look like when we were feeding them into the model. And so like most of the time, the model was like pretty good at answering these questions, so it's able to know that February is 4 months after October. But the first thing that we did is just started by looking for like these circular representations again. So what we just trained probes to find like these same circular structures that were found in previous work. So you could find like a little circle for the input month October, as well as probing at the last token position, showing that like the model is representing its outputs and also like a circular structure as well. And so you have this like sort of input circle and output circle. And somehow there's some mechanism in the middle or some little function or mechanism that takes in like 4 in October and then outputs like February on this circle. So our goal for this project was to just basically figure out how this computation was like actually occurring. Like if somehow the model was like using the circular structures to like compute this like answer. So the method that we use to do this is DAS, or distributed alignment search. And so the basic intuition, I won't go into all the details, but the basic intuition is just that we know that there's like some sort of computation going on at the last token position. And what we want to do is like figure out how we can sort of localize where all of this information is being stored. And the way we can prove that we localized it is like if we're able to sort of swap out or like intervene on the inputs and outputs of this mechanism in like a reliable way. So for example, I put the prompt from before as like a little mini version down here, where I just drew this little rectangle to indicate like the hidden state at the last token position, or like at a given layer. And what you can do is you can actually construct another prompt, like a counterfactual prompt, that's just like the same template, but like different input variables. So like 2 months after May instead of 4 months after October. And here's the hidden state from that counterfactual prompt. And what we're basically trying to do is like learn a subspace such that like you can patch from the counterfactual into the original prompt and just change like specifically a little bit of information in the original prompt. So for example, if you're doing DAS, training DAS to find a subspace for like the input month, you would want to be able to patch from this counterfactual and just change that this input month to May without changing the number. And so like you would expect that if you had overwritten this and changed it to May, then you would now have 4 months after May, which would be September. So we use like distributed alignment search to like find the subspace. And the thing with this method is that we have to basically try training this at like, we just focus on the last token position and we just try training it at every layer and see at which layers you can even do this. And if it's possible to do this, then that's like an indication to us that that's like the information is actually there at that layer. So this is the results from that. So like this first plot is just showing the results for training DAS to try to localize the input concept. So we do this like separately for each task. So for example, for months, that would be like localizing October, which is what I just showed. And then you can also do this for weekdays. It's like for Friday, or for hours, like the input hour. And also we did this for addition. So just like the first number in like a regular old addition prompt, like A plus B. And so what this plot shows is like the y-axis is just like, you can just think of it as like how well you're able to train DAS to do this like swap. And what's really interesting that we weren't actually expecting is that like all of these tasks have like a really similar sort of signature, where like you can see that the information gets copied over around like layer 15 or so. And then you can sort of like swap out this input concept without changing any other information right before like a specific MLP is applied. And then after that point, you like, it's way harder to like change that information. And so we actually find that this is the same thing for like offset. So if you try and train DAS to like localize like the like 4 months after October, 2 days after Friday, you also see that it gets copied over in middle layers, and then like there's a point at which it becomes way harder to like swap out this information. And after that point, you also see like afterwards is when you're also able to like then patch the output concept really reliably. And so like taking all these plots together, what we sort of interpret this as is like the model is copying over like 4 and October, and then like it's doing some operation here that sort of was like merging or fusing these two concepts together, such that after that point you can no longer like it's sort of like computed the output in some way. You can no longer like intervene and change them anymore. So that was like, yeah, so that was like this thing that's just characterizing like sort of the flow of information, and this is just all at the last token position. But then what we want to do is like figure out what actual operation it's doing here. So like we were doing a bunch of exploratory stuff, and the thing that gave us the big hint was actually just doing logit lens. So this is just a screenshot from like my own research notebook, and like we found that like if you look at the hours task, for example, so it's now 22, what time will it be in 4 hours? Then we could see that like if we did logit lens around here where we knew that the output was already computed, then you could actually see the model would, like logit lens would reveal the model has encoded the number 26. So just like 22 plus 4, even though like that's not actually an hour. And you can see that in later layers, it then converts it into like the hour at 2 a.m. Before that, it actually had just done like a sum of like 22 plus 4. And so we saw this for like the hours task, but it was sort of unreliable for the other tasks. But it kind of gave us like a hint that maybe we should start looking for like a mechanism that was just like addition, like literally just the model adding the two inputs. So then we're now pretty sure that the shared mechanism is addition because we ran some experiments where we're patching between different prompts or between different tasks. So for example, if you patch from an addition prompt into a month's context, then you can get the model to output like a correct month. So for example, like if I have the prompt 7 plus 7 equals 14, which the model can do really well. If you patch from this addition prompt into like a month's context, then it overrides whatever the model is outputting in that month's context and actually outputs a month that corresponds to the number that you patched in. So for example, here the sum is 14, and then 14 mod 12 is 2. So that means like February is the second month. So the model is outputting February. And this is like our results for doing this for all the tasks. And I guess like what I would want to highlight from this is just like, yeah, this is the line for like how often the model outputs the month that we expected. And you can see that this red line is just how often it outputs like the number that you patched in. So you can see that it's never actually just outputting the number, like it's always outputting like a month conversion of the number. Yeah. And then you can also go like the other way around as well. So if you patch from a month prompt into an addition prompt, then this reveals like the number that the model was calculating in the month's context. So if I patch from 4 months after October into an addition prompt, then you like, because the model is actually calculating 4 plus 10, you can see that like this patch results in the model outputting 14. And yeah, there's some, this is like the results for all of the experiments. And yeah, there's some details, but I don't know if we have time to talk about all of them. But basically like from this evidence, like we're pretty sure, like going back to our original poll, that like we're pretty sure we can say that Llama is using addition to compute to like as this intermediate step to decide like what the output month is going to be. But since I have like maybe 5 extra minutes, we had a little time to like look into how it was actually doing this addition. So we were really focused in on the layer 18 MLP because that was like the last point before which like where you could still like sort of patch and change like the offset or the month. And then afterwards, when like the concept becomes a lot stronger, the output concept becomes stronger. So what we did is we just looked for neurons that in the layer 18 MLP that are actually overlapping a lot with the output subspace. So this is just a little histogram of like how much each like all the neurons at layer 18 MLP are like writing into this output subspace. And we found about like 28 neurons. This is just a recap of neurons. We found about 28 neurons that are like writing really heavily into like this output month subspace. And what was really cool is that if we did this for all the tasks, these neurons were actually like almost exactly the same. So for example, like we found about like 16 neurons for months, and all of them were also important neurons for the addition task as well. So like they were all like the same neurons. And then what happens is if you then plot the activations of these neurons averaged across like possible output sums, we saw this like really like striking sort of like ribbon-y pattern where like you could group together all the neurons based on like a different periodicity that they fire across output sums. So for example, like these two neurons would fire for every other output sum, whereas these ones fire for like every 10 numbers, but all in like different phase shifts. And so as soon as we saw this, then we were like, realized that we're now interacting with a bunch of prior work that people have done on like how models do addition using Fourier features. And so, yeah, I know this is like going really, really fast, but basically like in previous work, people have found that models, like when they're doing addition, they can represent numbers as a bunch of different, like with a bunch of different wavelengths. But you could also think about it as like a bunch of different orthogonal circles with different periodicities, where you can sort of think of each circle as a little dial that where you like turn it to indicate what number it is. So for example, if you have like periods 2, 5, and 10, you could represent the number 6 by saying like 6 mod 2 is 0, and then 6 mod 5 is 1, and 6 mod 10 is 6. And so like we were able to train these this is like actual model activations. And we were able to like rediscover like from prior work how people have found these like Fourier features. But then what we found is that like all these little clusters of neurons, each one that fires at a specific frequency actually like writes to the circle, to like the specific plane corresponding to that frequency that people have found in prior work. So for example, like all of these period 5 neurons, they fire for like every 5 numbers. And then if you plot their down projections on like the period 5 circle, you can see that they're all like pointing in like different directions on this circle. And what's really cool about this is that we can actually like then visualize like an actual forward pass. So like in a real forward pass, like this is the neuron's like weight. But what would happen is like the neuron has a specific activation that scales this vector to either be like, you can be like negative, if it's like -3, you'd be like back here, or if it's like 2, you'd be like out here. And so like we can just record what the activation of each neuron is in an actual forward pass and see like, this is for like a real forward pass. Like if you have 18 plus 4, all these neurons are like scaled at different amounts such that when you like add all these vectors together, it creates a vector that like points roughly towards like the correct answer for this like addition prompt. Because like, yeah, you have 18 plus 4 is 22, and then mod 5 is 2. And so then it points to like 2 on this. And so you can also do this for like all of the different periodicities and see that like the model is like doing this addition sort of simultaneously for like all of these different, on all these different orthogonal planes. Yeah, I know it's like a lot of details, but feel free to ask me about it later, and I can definitely talk about it. But yeah, like that's basically like the paper, and like to return to like the overall big question of like the structure and representations imply structure and computations. I think from this we can say that like the answer is probably not necessarily, because even though Llama has this like circular geometry that we started out trying to like look for, what we ended up finding is that it's actually just using like number representations in order to like calculate 3 months after June, and like then afterwards sort of converting it back into this circle. And so yeah, it's like not even using this specific geometry to do like modular addition.
Questions for Sheridan?
I'm not sure I fully quite what would it mean for it to do use structure from that.
Yeah, so I think the way that I was imagining it going in was like you would have like almost a really similar thing to like this kind of algebra where like you're computing a sum like mod 12. So like you're almost computing like directly in like the month space. If that makes sense. So like for example, like so one of the things that we were trying to look for at the beginning was like, oh, if you have like 2 months after October, maybe it would just have some like rotation operation that applies to the circle in order to get, and like whenever it's 2 months after something, you do the same rotation, but since it's a circle, it's like always gonna be like the correct answer. But the thing is like, yeah, it's actually doing all of its calculations in these like periodicities that are like 2, 5, 10. So basically like kind of base 10 periodicities, rather than like doing it like sort of respecting the
Yeah, so it's not like it just has like a all-purpose circle thing.
yeah, like
not a specific to months. Specific to.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it doesn't seem all that all purpose. It's on mod 5 and mod 10. It seems
All-purpose base 10 circle.
yeah, it seems like it would be out of place in the Babylonian number
Yes.
system.
Yeah.
Sheridan? I have
Like translation after they all people then converting to the mountain. You can like translation.
Yeah, it would somehow have to like the way that we didn't actually get time to figure out how it does the translation, but the way that I was imagining it is just that it sort of memorizes that 14 is February. And the reason why I was saying that is just because it's actually not very good at this task. So like once you start increasing the numbers, if you say like 20 months after October, it like can't do it anymore. And the errors it's making are like really like regular. So like we're thinking that like it somehow is just like memorized up to a certain point. That like 14 is February and 15 is March. But like it doesn't seem like it has a very nice way of translating it.
But you could see the number was correct.
Yeah, you could see that like it calculates, like if you did 20 months after October, it would calculate 20 plus 10. And you could like patch that value into addition, get it to output that value, but it couldn't actually like say what month that is.
Is that cool? Cool. Thank you very much for it. You
Okay. Yeah, so I think all of you know me. I'm Nikhil. Today I'll be talking about my most recent work, in which we are trying to understand spatial reasoning's capabilities of VLMs. Yeah, so this is a joint collaboration. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll start by first explaining this concept of variable binding, which I feel is fundamental to understanding spatial reasoning. I hope you remember this figure from previous class. Essentially what variable binding means is the ability to associate features to a particular object. Any intelligent system or machine should be able to do that for it to be acting correctly. So for instance, in this particular image, the intelligent system or the neural network should be able to associate horse with fedora and cat with a cat. In fact, to give you a more concrete example, let's say you give this particular image to a language model or a VLM and ask it to generate a caption. Let's say it does create that caption which looks coherent. I would argue that the model has actually understood the image, or its ability to generate the caption is actually consistent if it is able to do variable binding, which basically means that it is able to associate horse with fedora and cat with cat. If it's not able to do that, then I would argue that it's primarily just repeating something from its training data. And why do we care about variable binding? As I just said a bit earlier, that a number of previous work has shown that variable binding is very vital for spatial reasoning capabilities of VLM. In fact,
previous works have shown that the reason why VLMs are not able to do this kind of spatial reasoning task is primarily because of their limits on binding capabilities. Okay, so as interpretability researchers, then the question comes up, can we truly understand the spatial variable binding capabilities of VLM? And can we use that to maybe improve the model's performance and try to just get rid of the limits that we see in the behavioral performance? Okay, so before getting into the experimental details or the results, I just wanted to describe the architecture here. So we have the image and we have the text. We first break down the image into small patches. Then each of those patches actually becomes one token, which is fed into the VIT. And then there is another projector layer, which is just an MLP. And its role is basically to transform the embedding from the vision space to the language space. And these are supposed to represent the visual tokens. And these are fed into the language model backbone along with the text embeddings. And then just the language model does the normal language modeling task. And it just generates the next token. So that's the typical architecture. Okay. So coming back to our question of how does variable binding or spatial variable binding happens in VLM, there are I would say at least one paper which tries to answer that question. I'm just trying to give an overview of that paper. What it does is, or what it says is, the model sort of creates like an ordering information, abstract ordering information of the important concepts, like the features and the objects in the image. Then it basically uses those abstract piece of information to do the spatial reasoning task, and then finally dereferences those abstract piece of information to actually get the correct answer. Okay, so if the models actually use those ordering information, the question that we explore in this work is how or where exactly that ordering information is coming from, or where is it getting generated? Is it getting generated in the language model backbone, or is it coming from the vision encoder? We also try to understand how are they represented. Are they localized to specific visual tokens, or are they actually distributed across a bunch of visual tokens? And finally, we also try to understand the characteristics of those ordering information, whether they are encoding something more abstract, like this is the first animal in the figure, or something like this thing is present at coordinate 45, 45. We try to understand that as well. Okay, so that's the questions that we explored in this project. Now coming to the exact experimental setup. So we start with the most basic thing that I think you can imagine. We just take a square. We have an image with 3 squares. All of them are of equal sizes and different colors, spread either horizontally or vertically. And then we ask this question, something like the color of the square to the left of the green square is, and the answer should be red. Yeah, the answer should be red. And what we found was Qwen2b, Qwen27b instruct can do this task perfectly. So the first thing that we tried was actually to confirm whether, even for this task, the VLMs are using this ordering information or not. So for that, we did a interchange intervention or activation patching experiment. On the left-hand side, you see the clean example, and on the right-hand side, we have the counterfactual example. So the main difference here is that in the counterfactual example, the correct answer is the third square, which is the black one, whereas in the clean example, the correct answer is the first square, which is the red one. And essentially what we are trying to find is the representation of the order of the square. So if you patch in the order of the square from the counterfactual to the clean one, the answer should change from red to blue, because the answer should become the third square rather than the first square. That's the expected output, which is the blue. And we do the patching on the last token, residual string vectors. And this is the result. We see that around layer 20, 22, 23, the language model backbone is representing this ordering information of the order of the correct square. So now that we have confirmed that even for our simple task, the models are using ordering information, now let's start with our first main question. Where are this ordering information getting generated? So for that, we did a probing experiment. So what we did was, we took the visual token embeddings of each of these squares and passed it to a linear probe and asked it to classify whether that visual encoding corresponds to the first square or the second square or the third square. So that's basically the task. It's like a 3-class classifier task where the input is the visual token embeddings of one of the squares and the output is one of the 3 classes. And the training was done on 90 samples and testing was done on 30 samples, and we could find that even a linear probe can do this task perfectly. But the interesting thing was that the ordering information of the square was not localized only to the square tokens. But we found that ordering information is actually spread across background tokens as well. In fact, those ordering information formed like a patch, like a strip patch kind of pattern, suggesting that the ordering information of this red square is actually distributed in this entire strip. So this was, I think, one of our first surprising results, because I think most of the previous work in the language model space have shown that this ordering information is quite localized to either a single token or just 1 or 2 tokens. Okay, but that was a probing experiment. Probing experiment does not imply causality. Information might just be present there, but it may not be getting used for doing the task. So we did a causal experiment as well. What we did was we did actually 2 causal experiments. In one, we patched the entire strips, and in the other one, we only patched in the square token visual embeddings. And here, the idea of the counterfactual is still the same. That in the clean example, the answer is the left square or the first square, or in the counterfactual one, it's the right square. And after the patching, the output should change from the first square to the third square, which is the blue one. And when you patch the entire strip, what we found that those visual token embeddings are actually used to do the task. So if you do the patching, we see that the expected outcome in the final output. However, if you only patch the square tokens, like the visual token corresponding to the squares, we did not see enough causal impact on the final output. So if you combine these 2 results, that patching in the entire strip leads to the expected final output, while patching in only the square tokens does not lead to the final output, suggests that the information present in the background tokens in that strip is actually causally relevant. Okay, now coming to our second question. So previously we saw that this ordering information was generated by the vision encoder. So the question now is, what role does language model play? For that, what we did was we basically get rid of all the positional information or all the ordering information which is generated by the vision encoder. This is how we did that. It is a bit involved, so I think I'm going to skip it. But the idea of this experiment is to first get rid of all the ordering information and then do the same experiment again. So when we removed all the ordering information from the visual token, like from the vision encoder, what we found was decrease in degradation in the behavioral performance. The model performance decreased about 30 to 40%. However, it is still beyond chance, which is of 33%. Suggesting that even if you get rid of all the ordering information from the vision encoder, the language model backbone can still somehow compensate for that to do this kind of simple spatial reasoning task. So to check if the language model backbone also creates its own ordering information or not, we did the same experiment again. But yeah, as I said earlier, we basically got rid of all the ordering information from the vision side first. What we found was the language model backbone can actually, or the language model backbone actually does create its own ordering information, especially in its middle layer. So what overall story, what we found was like both the vision encoder and language model backbone actually creates their ordering information, but the one created by the vision encoder is actually the dominant one. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Variable binding is important for spatial reasoning. Spatial and variable binding is dependent on the ordering information, which is primarily coming from the vision encoder. So if we improve the or enhance the ordering information from the vision encoder, can we improve the spatial reasoning capabilities of the model? So that was the next thing that we studied. And essentially what we did was we took the probing, like the probe direction, and used it as like a steering vector to enhance the ordering information which was present on the visual tokens. And we did it for all the visual tokens, not only for the square tokens. And what we found was, yeah, it does improve the spatial reasoning performance to a decent level. So this is the original model. It can do the task about 90% of the time. As a baseline, we also amplified, like we took a random direction and tried to amplify the visual token along that random direction. For some reason, it does improve it a little bit, but the amplification using our steering vector was much higher in comparison to the random direction. Okay. So finally, we asked this question. Like this is the final question that we have studied in this project. So we know that now that we have seen that the ordering information is coming from both the vision encoder and the language model backbone. Can we understand the characteristics of those ordering information? Are they actually encoding something more like an abstract information that this is like the first animal, this is like the first cap in the image, or is it something more absolute in the sense that this thing is present at coordinate X and Y? So to understand that characteristic, we use a slightly different task. We still have like a simple square setting, but the squares are either shifted towards left hand side or the right hand side. So this is where the squares are shifted towards the left hand side. And then we ask this question: what is the leftmost square? And the answer should be green. So here we again do a activation patching experiment. Here the counterfactual is actually shifted towards right. However, the absolute position of the blue square is exactly the same, like exactly the same coordinate in that image. And we patch the strips corresponding to each of the first and the third square. So the idea here is, if the model is representing the ordering information in the relative sense, then the output of this particular patching should be blue. Right? Because we have already seen that the answer to that question is the third square, where the answer to this image is the first square. So if you do the patching, the answer should become the third square and the answer should be blue. However, if the model is actually encoding the coordinate value, then the output should actually be brown. Why? Because assume that this is 3, 1, 3, this is 3, 2, this is 3, 3, and that brown would be 3, 4, and that green would be 3, 5. So after you do the batching, this green will become 3, 5. This brown will still remain 3, 2, and this blue will become 3, this will still remain 3, 3. So if you have 3, 5, 3, 2, and 3, 3, which is the leftmost one? This 3, 2, which is the brown one. That's why if the model is encoding absolute representation, the expected output should be brown. So when we did this experiment, actually what we found that it's kind of both. Model is encoding both relative and absolute piece of information, absolute positional information. So this is primarily for the vision encoder. So the information which is generated by the vision encoder has both absolute and relative characteristics, while the ordering information generated by the language model backbone is primarily relative in the sense it does not really have any absolute characteristics. That's it. So this is the conclusions from this work. That the first main thing that I think you should take away from this work is that information from the vision encoder, especially this kind of ordering information, which seems to be important for the spatial reasoning, is quite diffused. It's not really localized to specific vision tokens. And the characteristics of those ordering information is also different. While the language model, it is relative. For the vision encoder, it's a bit of both. And that also emphasizes the fact that we should be creating better vision encoders so that we have better or more capable VLM models. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Questions?
So, when you try to patch remember on the work, you try to patch the red square, blue square, and the green square. Did you try to also patch the? Yes. Did you also try to patch only the right part of the right instead without the actual right square?
Yeah, so you mean everything except the square?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we did that. So apparently even that was not sufficient.
Oh.
We had to include the square as well. So if you do that, you would get something like this. That the expected output won't be as strong as just the original output. So you need to include both the background tokens as well as the square tokens.
Thank you.
The way I think of it is like information is present even here and here.
Yeah.
And if you don't pass this one, it will still have the original information. So there will be kind of competition between the information here and the here. So because of that competition, maybe you won't be able to get effect in the final output.
Yeah. So it's like distributed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikhil. Cool. Brown illustration as the new slide.
Okay.
It's really cool.
Thank you.
It's great. So next we have Rohit. Right.
Can I reduce the lights here?
Oh, are you projecting on Zoom?
I am, yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
that's great.
Yes. Can people see it? Or are they seeing my presenter notes?
Are you guys able to see the presentation?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can see the presentation. Cool. Is there a way that I can reduce it?
What is that?
The lights.
Oh, yeah, we can reduce the lights. Yeah, I'm sure. Try it out.
Oh yeah. Thanks.
Is that good enough?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I have some dark images, so I don't want you to miss. What's up? Hello everyone. I'm Rohit. I am going to talk about a fun project that I've done in the spirit of this class. Even though I'm from David's lab, I don't consider myself doing surgical mech interp as my peers have done so far. So I wanted to I got inspired by you, what you're doing here. So it's laugh.
What are you doing inspired? I think you had, yeah, it's okay.
No, I don't do mech interp. Yeah. Anyways, you'll understand why. So yeah, I did. I mean, I have to get inspired because it's for the class. So yeah, I love comic books, and I wanted to understand how vision language models read these comic books in the first place. And then as I started working on this, it became really interesting project. So I extended it. So it says narrate images, but the main focus was on comic books, and I'll show you why. So let's do a fun little experiment. So I need all of your attention here. I'm going to show you an image in a flash. And I want you to remember as much as you can. And then I'll ask you a question. Cool. So if I ask what the scene was about, can most of you say what it was about? Yeah, it was a barn, maybe. So what if I ask you, was there a cat in the image, and can you describe that cat?
There's a cat, there's an orange cat in the.
Oh my god. Oh, yeah. Was there a person in the image?
Yeah. There's a guy in
Okay, you're all smart. Okay.
So, but how many people could say if there was a cat? And how many people could say there's a person? Oh, you.
And how many people can say there are two people? Oh, you finally got it. Alright. I looked at it for like hours, so I know how many people are. But okay, now if I show you this and say, oh, do you see your eyes? They started like scanning the image, right? And now how many of you can say if there are two people in it? Yes. Two people. There are two people in this.
maybe
Yeah?
far away. Yeah.
Two people left. So if I ask how does a cow look like, you can still say it, right? But I see that you started scanning. And if I ask you to keep describing the cow in detail, you'll probably keep looking at the cow and like trying to come up with more descriptions out of it. So this is what I want to test. Like, is this how this is how I read comics, by the way. I have to like pay attention to every panel that goes into the comic and try to get the story out of it. And I'm really curious if this is how vision language models do it too. Just like us, like gazing through the images. Here's another experiment. If I ask you to can you say what's the story of this comic? And if you're like somewhat into comics and understand how it works, you'll probably do this, right? Like you start gazing left to right. And I'm seeing most of your faces, you're doing that left to right, and then top to bottom, left to right again. And again, VLMs do a very good job at describing this comic in such amazing ways more than me. But then, does it do the same thing, like left to right? It does. And how does that emerge in the first place? And where are these mechanisms happening? That's part of the story of this project and how it goes. So traditionally, this wasn't like a huge problem for us in vision models, especially because it used to be really simple architectures where you feed in an image and you let the model give a classification output. Is it a cat or it's not cat, right? And it doesn't need to describe anything. It's just one forward pass and then it says, yeah, it's a cat. And some people have looked into what's happening. I don't know who those people are. It's David. It's in his thesis. But yes, they've looked into it and they found that there are neurons that look at specific objects in an image. So if you feed this image in, there might be some neurons that look at the cat's ears and some that look at the background and some at the whisks. What is it called?
Whiskers.
Whiskers. But then with VLMs, we have this new paradigm where you can talk to the image. You ask the model, describe this image, and it tells you word by word what's happening in that image, right? So what is happening inside? Like, is it still the same static? Oh, I'll assign 10 neurons, one to look at a cat, one to look at the background, and then just make a mush information out of it and just I'll start describing. Or does it pay attention to the specific regions it's describing currently? Like when it says the image shows a cute cat, perhaps all the neurons are just looking at the cat, right? It doesn't have to look at the background for it. So we're going to show you like some of cool things that we found using these this framework. So okay, I think I'll skip this because Nikhil had already gone about how the VLMs work in the first place. And the main reason that I say I got inspired by you is because I don't know how VLMs work before I started this project. So I had to like go into it and understand how it breaks an image and the tokens in the first place. So it gets like an image and a text as an input. And how does it combine these two modalities to sort of start talking to each other, right? So turns out it breaks this image into like multiple chunks. You can call that tokenization for image or like patchifying. And then it just lays out those tokens in a nice array. So the text is something we know what happens. You must have already seen in your class with language models. You tokenize them and then sort of embed them into these vectors. To bring the image tokens in a similar space, you train a small vision encoder on top, or specifically some layers in that, so that it brings it to the same dimensionality and to the same subspace as the text. And then you have a language model backbone, which actually does the question answering part, right? You ask a question, it says, oh yeah, it's a farm. So I think this is the part that I've been more interested in this work, where when it's answering this particular answer, this particular sentence, what image tokens are playing a major part in this decision that the model is taking. So so each token goes through multiple layers. So I'll also give a quick overview as what these layers are, right? So let's start from the last token before the model starts answering what's happening inside the comic or the image. So at first it goes through an attention layer, where the attention layer is the only layer in your entire model which sort of looks back at all the previous tokens that came before it, including the image and the text tokens. And then it takes a decision what sort of information should I bring in, processes it, and then puts it into an MLP. And then this repeats some number of times. These are what we call blocks inside the language model. And then you finally project it out into your text space, and then you get your token, right? And then you take the token, repeat it back, and do the same process again and again. Every time, your attention is the one that looks back and brings all the interesting information from your context. And modern day attentions, have you studied what multi-headed attention is? Yeah, okay. So instead of using one layer, you sort of split this mechanism, and each of these heads look at all the tokens again, and then they all bring in their individual information and sort of patch them up together. That's a rough overview of these. And the entire next 6 minutes of this talk is going to just talk about these attention heads. So we're going to use Qwen 3 vision language model. This is, I think, the latest vision language model there is. So an 8 billion model is what we are using. It has 36 layers, and each layer has one attention module, which is composed of 32 heads each. So that makes a total of 1,152 attention heads. And the one that we are more interested in is how many of them actually look at the image when they're describing it. And how does that mechanism look like? So we're going to use my favorite part, which is the comic books, as a test bed, because when you're describing a panel, you know exactly where the panel is because it's a nice formed rectangle, right? It's not like a natural image where there are objects everywhere and you have to go through semantic segmentations to know where the object is. So what we do is, and the work starts right off. So we say, tell me what's happening in panel 3 of this comic book. And then the vision language model is going to answer, oh yeah, in the query panel, a glowing tree bursts through the night sky. And what we do is we look into this VLM and try to understand if there is anything mechanism that looks only at that panel when it's describing it, right? I asked specifically for panel 3. I really wish that the model would just look at panel 3 and not the entirety of the image. Because there's a small background to this, which says when attention was built in the first place, all we wanted to do was, we really wish that we had a module inside these big language models that can actually attend to what's actually important, so that we bring in specific information from this huge context that we have. And for the first time in vision models, we have an opportunity to see if what we built actually works or not. Right? When the model is talking about panel 3, we really wish that the attention would just bring in the information from panel 3. Or at least just would focus on it, not the entire image, and sort of make a composed information. So we look through all the attention heads, and we build a very simple score, right? What we do is we query for a panel using text. I say what's happening in panel 3, and then I look through attention heads when it's about to utter about panel 3 and see how much of the information is actually going to the panel 3. So what I do is I take the raw attention scores and just sum them up only for those panel 3 tokens. Yeah. And that diagonal is what is like really interesting thing for us. We want to look at attention heads that focus on the panel that we actually queried in the first place. So when we plot most of the attention heads, we just randomly sample 100 attention heads and we plot it. This is how it looks like, right? If you see the score, it's 0.167, which is exactly the chance, 1/6. And the model, most of the, like we found that, oh shoot, the attention heads don't really like look at the panel that we are really interested in. Turns out they look at like random things. But then when we have a score now, right? Because we have this 6x6 grid that we built, we can just filter out the heads that have the maximum diagonal, right? Just sum up 6 numbers. Does that make sense? Yeah. We just sum up the scores when we ask for the query. Is it actually looking for it? And then we look at the top 6 heads and they look like this, right? We do have attention heads that look at the exact panel that we queried for, or at least right around that panel. And they do this task of, oh yeah, let me bring in the concept that I'm interested in. And we plot a histogram. Can you see this? And then we plot a histogram of this. And we found that a good chunk of the heads don't really look at the image information. There are very few that actually do this task. So, which is great. Like this is a good correlation evidence. We ask for a panel. There are some heads which look for a panel.
Sorry, like only look for the exclusive.
Yes, which exclusively look for the queried information. Right? This is a very simple task. I just ask for a panel and I look for attention heads that look for the panel. That's it. This doesn't really say much. So we wanted to look at some more details of this. Instead of asking for the panel, let me just say, describe this comic in detail. And the model is going to go inside and start describing things like, oh, sure, in panel 1, the boy does this. In panel 2, it's planting the seed in a pot. And it explains every panel there is in the comic. So again, we look inside and then we plot another trajectory plot, we call, where the x-axis is just the number of generated tokens that the model used to describe the comic. And the y-axis is just how much attention does each token pay attention to the panel in the images. So in this first 50 tokens, the model was just talking about panel 1, and then you can see the dashed lines where the model shifts to different panels. So in that panel 4, it talks about panel 4. This box says, when the model is talking about panel 1, does it pay attention to panel 1 or not? So when we plot this, again, for all the random heads, it looks almost black, but that's because of the scale. And I have a reason for that scale. If you really focus in, which you can't, there's still like some spread out attention in random places. But if I plot it back only on the gaze heads, this is how the plot looks like. It's a neat staircase attention, where you know when the model is talking about panel 1, it only looks at panel 1. Or at least like in a very strong sense. So the heads that we found through this querying technique actually are being used even when describing the comic in the first place. And this is not enough, right? This is what we call correlation evidence. We don't know if these heads are actually being used to talk about it. Maybe it's just an artifact that the model seems to be looking at the image but not really taking the information from it. So we now do causal experiments where we change the attention of these top 100 heads that have good gaze scores and see how this works. So when we ask the question, what is the cat doing in this comic? The baseline model would say something like, oh yeah, the cat goes for an adventure. It's a very decent answer that the model gives. So now what I do is I change the attention mask of only the top 100 gaze heads to just focus on that panel. I black out every other attention that goes through it. So first, let's do it on random heads. And then the model says this, which hasn't changed anything. And then I change it for the top 100 gaze heads. And then the model says the cat discovers a map, which is what it's doing. Now, you can ask me, hey, what if I change all the attention heads? If I do that, then the model just breaks. It doesn't give any good information. So you do this for like different things. the model gives different answers. Again, the input is still the same. I'm just changing the gaze or the attention of 100 heads out of 1100. So I keep changing, it gets from a different score. I like this one where I change it to two panels at the same time, and it sort of makes up a story from only the two panels. It says, oh, it discovered a portal to go to space. So this is actually a very strong evidence where we found that 97% of the time when you change just the attention of these 100 heads, the model always changes its answer based on only the query pan or like the focus that you changed it to. And any random head doesn't really do much. And if you change all the heads, it's just breakdowns. So you can also like do this while the model is talking. You can dynamically go in and change the gaze. And then it starts switching its description from one panel to another in a very smooth way. When you say describe this comic, the model usually should start with panel 1 because, hey, it does left to right. But if you start with this, it says bullet point number 1. There are two friends hiking through the forest. Right? And it has bullet points, which goes from 1 to 10 or whatever, but it's describing the panels that we asked it to look at. So after 50 tokens or so, I switch the gaze to like some other random fourth token. And then you see how smoothly it stitches in that the children explores the jungle and then they somehow stumbled upon a hidden cave. Although that's not what happened in the comic, since you switch the gaze, it's trying to stitch in the story very smoothly into a very good, this, I'm going to go show multiple different things. The same point, which is you can make the model switch its narration order by just changing 100 different heads. Yeah, and then it ends with saying, yeah, sure, that explore the forest, there's a joyful, blissful moment. And it does this. And it turns out these are not these are generic heads that are not just used to read comics. When you ask about a natural image and describe this image, it does, these 100 heads also look at what it's describing. So the model starts saying, yeah, there's like a blank white canvas mounted to it. And when you go and look at the gaze heads patterns, they look only at that blank paper that it's describing at the moment. So yeah, it does different globe, there's like some paintbrushes, there's a rolled up paper on the canvas. And finally, it also looks at the watermark from Gemini and it says, oh yeah, there's like a white star-shaped watermark there is. And then the gaze heads are looking at the watermark. You can also causally change it. When you say list the objects, it starts listing the objects from left to right. And then you just focus your attention only on this bicycle. And then the model naturally starts saying, yeah, there's just a bike, motorcycle. And then there's like, this is a funny one because I mistakenly left a tractor's tire there. So it says, oh yeah, there's a tractor too in there. But then it starts talking only about the bike. So yeah, like 9% of the attention in your VLMs are used for the thing that we build attention for, which is look through the things that you're actually describing and do this. That's a very raw form of saying it. I wouldn't put it in my research paper, but it's a good statement to say when it's like a presentation, I guess. There are other heads which are being used for language part, but the thing which I was more interested in is gaze. Look at the object that you're describing. And it does. There are 9% of attention heads that do it. So yeah, thanks so much.
I have one question.
Yes.
So for the comics, you are only testing comics reading from left to right instead of like, for example, in Japanese comics, we have the reading sequences is completely different. It's supposed to be from right to left.
Yeah.
Have you tested on that?
Yes. So VLMs do very bad in mangas.
Oh, really?
Yeah. None of the VLMs do it. Even like Gwen doesn't do a good job at reading a manga. And this is a very well documented study actually. And people have done different heuristics to sort of make it read a manga. You can literally say to read it from right to left, and then it does a good job at reading it. But if you just give it a, it doesn't do it inherently.
I see.
Yeah.
But if I instruct it to read from right and left, does the gaze has also follows the instruction?
It does, yeah. Gaze heads also start looking like the staircase pattern becomes a reverse staircase where it starts from P6 and then goes back to like P1. Yeah, so that's a very good point. We still don't know what is the mechanism that is asking the gaze heads to go from P6 to P1 or P1 to P6. But we know that there are heads that are used to look the pattern that we asked them to look for in the first place. But it's still an open question for us as to what is causing the gaze heads to do this. We don't know.
Right, because we actually have the instructions in words instead of in the image. So it's interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's some questions. So,
Oh yeah, we have a couple. We can take the questions on Zoom for everybody.
oh yeah.
So yes. Does anybody? Are you guys on Zoom? Eric and Sheridan and Nikhil.
Yeah, I think most of the questions got answered.
They got answered on Zoom. You guys texted the answers.
I guess they can say if they just tell it.
Yeah. If anybody remote has any questions, we can take a couple minutes.
Yeah, I don't think there were any questions for.
Okay. That's great.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.